all for being here today. I especially want to thank both the History Department, the Spanish Department, and the Public Library for supporting this talk, and I hope that you will be, at the very least, amused by it. Can everybody hear me okay?
You mentioned...
Yeah, I'll get to it on page 9. So I was told to direct this talk primarily towards undergraduates, so I apologize if it may be a little simple for you. I also, I'll start. My topic today, men in makeup, seems like a really odd choice when addressing the Spanish Golden Age, which is roughly from the 16th to 16th and 17th century on the Iberian Peninsula in what is now today Spain. Most people with a passing idea of what Spain was like during this time imagine it as the sort of ultra-conservative kingdom that held tight to Roman Catholic orthodoxy, was involved in almost constant warfare, was overburdened by taxes and depleted in both currency and manpower. I am, of course, speaking in generalities here and of first-hand impressions, but they suffice to indicate that Spanish men and makeup are not really images that are readily conscious for this period. And yet, they do appear with some relative frequency in the satirical poetry of men like Francisco de Quevedo, who lived between 1580 and 1645. Repeated images of men in cosmetic adornment, often serving as mirrored negative examples, the bald man, for example, appear in Quevedo's satirical poems. These examples feature within satire. They featured so as to reinforce prescriptive attitudes towards masculinity, attitudes guided by Christian ideas, and in so doing, they criticize, potentially, a weakened Spain that has abandoned its ancient martial principles. They take up classical themes, oftentimes linked to cosmetic use, to expose, in an analogous and interpretive way, society's corruption and vice. So, before I start, there are two caveats to be made. The first is that I use makeup in a very loose way, for any type of cosmetic applied to the body to embellish or adorn it. In this talk specifically, hair dye and an anti-wrinkle cream, whose ingredients you see in the table in front of you. I really apologize if you were expecting blush and eyeshadow. Not going to happen. Sorry. The second is that, as Professor Luque has mentioned, is that I am a medievalist who works at the close of the Middle Ages. And it's a 15th century, late 15th century. It's a transitional time between the late Middle Ages, the Middle Ages and the early modern, and that means basically that anything I talk about, I kind of feel this compulsive need to give background on the material that I talk about. So that's caveat 2, part A, and caveat 2, part B, is that this is a topic that is slightly outside of my scope of interest. So I want to conclude this brief introduction by saying that I will be very grateful for your comments, your advice, if I've forgotten anything or I've ignored something important, even if I've ignored something not too important. But basically, I'm hopeful that you will have any suggestions on how to fine-tune this argument that I'm making. Now, before we can talk about negative examples, which is seen in the makeup, we should dedicate a little time to the notion of idealized versions of masculinity. The importance of Christian attitudes in the early modern period, and especially those directed towards ideal masculine behaviors, was developed centuries in centuries of thought on this matter, and might be seen as specifically mediated through the aging process. For example, St. Augustine, whom I think all of you in the audience should know about, given the class we were briefly talking about. St. Augustine connected the days of creation to the 7 ages of man, really 6 days plus 1 to represent the hereafter. These ideas gave the educated man a way to make sense of the passage of time, correlating a certain set of ideal behaviors to each period. Other scholars like Ruth Mazo Harris have focused on constructs of masculinity based on social conditions as opposed to religious theories, right? With a period of youthful manhood for especially the knightly and the noble classes, And this period of youthful knighthood correlated strength, power, and I would also argue beauty to a certain space and time. Now, texts, both in the Middle Ages and in the early modern, have no fixed limits as to the onset of when useful manhood begins or ends, right? But they roughly correspond, maybe to Augustine's idea, the fourth age of youth. And in an attempt to set some sort of guidelines, youthful manhood for Paris could start somewhere in one's early teens and last until early 30s. The prime of life for men could extend maybe as far as into the 50s. Now, distinguishing when the prime of one's life and the beginnings of old age is slightly more difficult, even though they come, for the most part, at the onset of one's 60s. And this is important because age is going to be very important as a rationale for cosmetic. So, examples from the medieval literature reinforced, if somewhat imperfectly, an adherence to ages and stages. Ideal representations of men displayed in their youth or at their prime, projected strength and power tacitly conferred upon by God that justified them as leaders of their people. We'll talk about this in a second. The adornments that are used strategically to promote their social and political power enhance their appearance. Reading biblical stories, especially from the Old Testament, oftentimes emphasizes man's youth and strength symbolically, a beautifying marker of hair. For example, stories like that of Villanova suggest a connection between strength, manes, and divine light. Now, this type of connection between a man's hair and his virile strength also appears in Castilian epic poetry, like the Cantar de mi Cid. And in this epic, the legendary hero is Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, seen here in a statue in Burgos, right? In here, the beard of the legendary hero Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar makes repeated appearances through epithets. He is el de la barba luenga, no, he of the long beard. He's also la barba tan cumplida, right? The most accomplished beard. In the second of the songs, making up the oral poem, the Cid vows never to cut his hair. Now, this might be explained as a youthful boast, but seems more likely to be a symbolic reference of his noble qualities. His loyalty to the king, steadfast loyalty to the king, despite the fact that the king has exiled him, is one such virtue, right? Or it's also a visual representation of his honor and his strength. In the trial that's found in the end of the third song, the Cid and his men take really good care with their persons. They dress up in costly garments they've won from the sports of war against the Muslims in Al-Andalus, and the Cid shows particular concern for his hair and his head and his facial hair, setting the former in a fine net and gathering the latter in a cord. These actions, while appearing ornamental, had social and strategic value. Visually, they were the mark of an accomplished knight, and held in the net and the cord, the Cid's grooming avoids any physical attacks on his hair, which must not be mussed or yanked. So for whatever reason, I always think of like a little cat fight going on, which is really anachronistic, but really funny to just put to your head about this epic hero, right? Anyway, so Cid's careful concern for hair has symbolic importance that highlights his power when entering a court from which he had been exiled. Returning to that court a second time, his hair is a visual cue of his military power and a cautionary tale to those who still harbor ill will towards him. This magnificent beard, right? That produces awe. In this light, the sight of his hair calls to mind the negative example of the Count de Garcia, whose backstory is read through in the unevenness of his beard and mentioned in the third cantar. The epic makes clear that the Cid had, when besting the Count at his castle in Cabra, defeated him and torn out chunks of his hair that has yet to grow back. So, the Cidian show of strength appears again. It's a recurring motif, this time in another epic known about the Cid called the Novedades del Cid. It is written after the cantar, but it refers to his youth. And it narrates at least two other instances in which tearing out beard hair visually determines a lack of masculine prowess and uglifies the body. Now, in comparison to youth and beauty, which was generally idealized in medieval masculine literary representations, old age was described in a much more complicated fashion. From the atemporality of the Garden of Eden, post-lapsarian man suffered age through time as a consequence of sin. In the allegorical writings of the Church Fathers, age was represented often through sinful ugliness. St. John's Chrysostom and Augustine established a connection that associated aging with a sinful experience, but also repentance with rejuvenation. The white hair of an aged man demonstrated his wisdom and was visually understood as an example of exemplarity that contradicted the generally negative associations regarding aging. As Georges Minois, social historian, understood it, the early medieval commentaries regarding aging put man on this kind of dual contradictory path. A man's white hair symbolized his venerable, wise, intellectually beautiful nature, but his wrinkled skin exposed his sin. Moreover, and even though Christian authors drew from the connection between a healthy old age and virtuous living, they also believed that that connection was really rare. Okay? Probably because people got wrong when thinking about it. That's another tale. Those lucky enough to live the contradiction, to be wise and have beautiful white hair, right, appeared to be few and far between, and they were also somewhat subject to suspicion. For this reason, one might understand the rationale behind the activities that are criticized by St. John Chrysostom and later on by St. Bernard of Clairvaux. These men remind older men to avoid contradicting the color of their aging hair by acting improperly. So, the notion of cosmetic impropriety, the dyeing of the hair is acting improperly. This might also be seen in other Castilian stories. Cosmetic impropriety, right? Especially those that are influenced by religious thought, like that of the Count Lucanor. Now, few medievalists have paid attention to the cosmetic explanations found in the moral didactic work of Don Juan Manuel. He wrote in the in the 14th century. He wrote a frame tale narrative composed of 51 short stories, filled with practical advice for educating noblemen. Each tale is preceded by a conversation between the Count and his counselor, Padronio, in which the Count seeks advice from Padronio on the topic of socio-political importance. That's him right here. I'll scroll back to the other one. So, in the book, Padronio counsels his lord through stories that fold an answer to the Count's problems. And in the 24th frame tale narrative of his work, the Count asks the counselor how to know who will be a promising young man, who of the promising young men who are living in his household will turn out to be good men. Okay. Now, Padronio's reply is careful and measured. He allows for the impossibility of knowing the future. But the counselor then hits upon external and external signs of a man's future worth. Although he refines his answer by noting that signs may appear contradictory, he opines the following. And I'm just going to do my translation and not the Spanish, but I will pay attention to one word that's in the Spanish translation because it is important. Okay. So, Padronio says, the truest signs are those that are in the face, particularly those of the eyes, as well as grace of movement. These signs rarely deceive. And don't believe that the elegant one is called so because he has a beautiful or an ugly face, since many men are beautified and handsome, but do not have masculine grace. And others appear ugly even while they have that gracefulness that is considered to be a fine man. So, the word in question here is the word pintados, which I translated as to beautify. And certainly there's some room for interpretation as to the meaning of the word pintado, but some form of beautification, be it adornment or cosmetic, is implied here. Few modern editions of the Lucanor make mention to this masculine embellishment. Their editors presumably working under the belief that the practice of masculine adornment would run counter to the central message of the mirror of this text. I would argue, however, and I think this is really important to note, that the text mentions cosmetic adornment to a basically at best an ambivalent sign of man's ability to govern. The key message is that physical beauty is not an indictment for one's capacity to govern, but also that men that beautify themselves warrant a certain amount of suspicion. So the suspicious nature of physical masculine beauty, right, is there, but it's not necessarily tied to generally negative qualities. There's some sort of ambivalence. Even still, it warrants a little bit of suspicion. And even within other works of medieval wisdom literature, there are indications that men did, in fact, beautify themselves. People were suspicious by it. So the final chapter of the Bocados de Oro, for example, it's a 13th century text that was translated, I think, in Alfonso X's translation workshop, I guess you'd call it, right? And it was translated from an Arabic source. I believe Dr. Duque could have more to say about this than I do. Anyway, the final chapter of the Bocados de Oro, for example, invites the reader to think much about the inclusion of this aphorism. Right? He says, he saw an old man dyeing his hair and said to him, even if you hide your gray hair, you won't be able to hide your old age. So this last example underscores a wish to turn back time. Right? This possibility of which appears at least in one medical work of the late Middle Ages. The 15th century anonymous medical treatise, which is transcribed by Maria Teresa Herrera and newly christened with the anachronistic title Tratado de la Patología General, includes an entire chapter on how to treat old people and includes a recipe on on wrinkles, on how to treat wrinkles. Now, the work is believed to be a summary derived from the 3rd and 4th books of Avicenna's canon, 11th century text translated after the 13th century and brought into the Latin West. And it tells you what to do for your las enrugaduras del rostro, right? The wrinkles on one's face. So, if we have time afterwards, it might be nice to try to mimic this recipe if you're interested in it, because all of the ingredients, well, except for the lead cereus, because that's poisonous. All of the ingredients, except for the poisonous one, are up there, and we could probably try to make this wrinkle cream and see if it works. So, it's important to note what he says about wrinkles in the first line, though. He says, face wrinkles. This occurs at times, like what happens to old people, and may be the result of an unhealthy life, right? Una mala vida, right? Or from eating bad food. And for this, one should take cured wax and cereus. That's the poisonous part, it's lead. And beef tallow, each in equal parts. Take the tallow and the wax and mix them together with rose oil. Apply to the face in the morning and evening. I have to comment very briefly here on the fact that the last two examples that I've just used, the Bocados de Oro and this medical treatise, introduce new attitudes towards aging and beauty, and they're from Islamic culture. These two works were brought into the Latin West through Al-Andalus. Their incorporation into works written in Castilian, I would suggest, allows for these shifts in changing about age and aging. I am not as knowledgeable about the transmissions of these texts from Arabic into the Castilian languages to opine definitively on the topic. I will limit myself to saying that once in Castilian, these texts provide an opportunity for this new community of readers to start thinking differently about aging. So take the anti-wrinkle cream as an example. It's one of several listed in the chapter and contains ingredients not like what we see in body lotions today. The recipe here remits an association of wrinkles with old age by only circumstantially connecting it to a bad lifestyle. So it says, quizás será de la mala vida. Maybe it will be from living a bad life. But it also says, maybe it will be caused by eating bad food. The text separates the idea of sin from the process of aging, indirectly justifying, so maybe wrinkles are caused by living an immoral life, or maybe they're caused by bad practices. The text, in doing so, separates the idea of sin from the process of aging, and indirectly justifies its purpose, to keep the old seemingly youthful. Palliative care for old people is discussed further in an entire chapter entitled De los Viejos, on old people. The chapter begins by noting the complexion of old people. It talks about how a person's humoral complexion is altered in old age. Age is a medical process caused by the person's normal humoral complexion to be deprived of its natural humidity or its normal warmth. Humors being a way that people discuss age and sickness in the pre-modern world. The anonymous author admits that man, who's when deprived of his natural conditions, makes curing maladies difficult. The author postulates the possible methods of treatment, suggesting the purging of phlegmatic humors and the ingestion of certain types of food to restore the humoral balance of older men. He recommends specific products to eat, as well as how to sleep, with whom and how often. Now, these treatments refer specifically to men. I know that sometimes when you read man in the Middle Ages, you have to think about humankind, but this is specifically to men because the author suggests coitus with more than one woman at the same time in winter to rejuvenate his humoral balance. Obviously, also a heteronormative condition here that we're talking about. So what I find sad about this is that the author refers also to two books. One is a book on the foods of sick people for information on healthy eating, and a book on makeup for the use of pleasing aromas, oils, and unguents. And there is no modern reference that I can find, no modern record that I can find for these books. Very sad. But to continue, the medical author then cautions those who have aged more rapidly than they ought to have. But this is what you should do. As might be referred from the wrinkle cream noted above, noted here, these prematurely aged men should take particular care. And he concludes, this author concludes by distinguishing aging from the aged. For the latter, those who are very old, specifically for this author, men over 60, a different medical protocol must be observed. So to summarize, the ideal tropes of manhood are represented in a variety of ways, and these contradict the negative stereotypes of cosmetics and aging. For the strategically adorned youthful man at the top of his game, ornamentation is viewed as an enhancement of his idealized features. Some distrust is given to the untried youth who tries to embellish his appearance, but in any case, any allowance for adornment wanes as a man's hair goes white. For Christian theologians, white hair was a symbol of his wisdom, which may be seen as a rare form of intellectual beauty. And it was impolitic and immoral to conceal this white hair. Contrary to these idealized images was the visual cue of wrinkles, which was representative not merely in the passage of time, but it was also indicative of sinfulness. Towards the close of the Middle Ages, a lessening of that moralistic interpretation of aging may be seen, but it does not get overturned by any stretch of the imagination, right? However, we do see in the medieval pathology of, that is based on Avicenna's canon, this drawing out of an idea that lifestyle and body composition might be factors determining how one aged. The body showcased certain markers that determine beauty, specifically hair, right? Which continue to appear in literature of the early modern period. So now that I've foregrounded certain markers of beauty, right? Hair, natural or gone grain, or gone gray, or the lack thereof, or wrinkles, right? I'm going to make a significant leap now to the court poetry of Francisco de Quevedo, who wrote during the time of the Habsburg kings. So Quevedo, like I said before, was born in 1580, died in 1645. He was living during the Habsburg kings, Philip III and Philip IV. Okay? Now, I don't know if students here study Quevedo. They rarely do in my university. But if they do, they usually focus on his poetry. Maybe the identification of a certain poem or corresponding themes, poetic styles like modernismo or literary tropes, right? Maybe some classical borrowings. But rarely do we have the time to talk about how these poems related to their moment in time. And I think that's really something very necessary for Quevedo. I can't do that in the time allotted. I think you guys would rebel. But I think what maybe I can do is give you a brief understanding of who he was, and that will maybe encourage you to read further in the area. We know that Quevedo was the son who was born to a minor noble family, and that family lived at court. There are seminal scholars on this work, like Ignacio Arellano. He notes that Quevedo's father had been the secretary to Ana de Austria, who was the fourth wife of Philip IV. And yes, Philip II, Philip II's fourth wife. We're not talking the same thing as the English Henry VIII, okay? Philip was widowed 3 times, so not the same thing at all. But Ana of Austria was his fourth wife, and Quevedo's father was probably his secretary. And Enrique Fernandez, who's another scholar, claims that Quevedo's father had professional duties that included dealing with tailors and other purveyors of royal family. He was a minor nobleman who had to work in service to the king and the king's wife. Now, Quevedo's mother and his grandmother had served as lady-in-waiting, possibly to the same Ana of Austria or another one of the queens at the time. So they were aware of kind of like the strict behaviors in court, but they were also aware that everybody, regardless of station, right? Everybody had to eat and sleep and use the toilet, right? They were worried with the practical aspects of day-to-day courtly life. And so they didn't see them as these rarefied, noble people. However, Quevedo had to deal with rarefied noble people. In his dealings with the Duke of Lerma, he would have added to his understanding of the interconnectedness of higher ranks with larger Spanish society. In 1613, we know that Quevedo left Spain to join the Duke of Osuna, Pedro Tellez Giron, who was the viceroy of Sicily. In 1516, we know that the Sicilian parliament sent Quevedo back to Madrid to present a triennial contribution of 300,000 ducats to the Spanish king. So he had become a person of quite some importance and dealt with members of the court, both high and low. We also know that he had a certain amount of friendships and antipathies. So he was a really good friend of Lope de Vega, and he absolutely detested Luis de Góngora. He even kicked him out of, Quevedo kicked Góngora out of his house once when poor Góngora was getting to the end of his rope and had become, honestly, I don't know for sure, but he seemed to me like he was losing his marbles. Anyway. The extent to which Quevedo was aware, acutely aware of the intricacies of courtly life, has led scholars to study the relationship of his poetry and the court, seeing in the former, his poetry, a critique of the latter, the court. So his poetry, especially the satirical poems, criticized the court. Ignacio Arellano has understood that much of the satire present in Quevedo's output deals with social classes, that they are tied either very closely or sometimes quite loosely to one's social class, even while he understands that the most noble of noblemen to the most lowest of scribes all were dependent on the institutions of power represented by the court. And because of this, Quevedo is quick to find quick to sketch out these galleries of portraits of those who lived in the margins and criticize them. And we're talking everybody, right? From pastry makers, barkeeps, tailors, shoemakers, judges, lawyers, scribes, officers of the law, from the highest to the lowest, doctors, apothecaries, and also those who were in the underbelly of society. He was really tactful, though, and not really ever criticizing the monarchy. But those, especially in the underbelly of the society, they represented maybe court figures turned in a world upside down, in a court upside down. So pimps, prostitutes, gentlemen who are fake but pretended to be gentlemen, ruffians, they all had a place in his poetry, and they all had, not all, but a lot of them had political significance. Arellano classified these poems that we deal with today as those that are figurations of vice, showing hypocrisy through the opposition between what is there and what is pretended to be there. So this is kind of a way of talking about one of the words that's bandied around a lot in the Baroque period, this idea of desengaño, this disillusionment with court life, right? Because what you see is not what is really there. There's a falsity to appearance. There's a hypocrisy to what you see. Now, within the figurations of vice, old men appear frequently as masks that reflect the inner moral corruption or an ungainly political pursuit of the characters within. These old men are often cosmetically ridiculed by their unlovely descriptions of aging bodies. In another satirical work, the Epistola Satírica, the satiric epistle, letter, Mark Maschia has underscored how Quevedo took a critical and disenchanted outlook on Spanish identity and suggests, Mark Maschia does, that the overarching feeling of this desengaño, this disillusionment caused by this abusal of a belief or an idea, that informs his idea of what Spanishmen are. We might extend these ideas to a romance, a ballad, written by Quevedo called Varios Linajes de Calvos. This is various lineages of bald men. And he insults bald men. There we go. He insults bald men by calling them, among other references, a capón de cabeza, right? A head gelding. He also calls them desbarbado hasta la nuca, an unbearded man up to the nape. A lampiño de la mollera, a beardless brain. A vejiga, a bladder. A calva de mapamundi, a wrinkled or a lined, bald-headed map. A calavera de espejuelo, a shiny bald skull. The plays on words with calvos are non-stop, right? He calls unlucky brides calvicasadas, those who are married to the bald. The poem associates bald men with the verb pelar, a definition which implies the pulling out of one's hair, but also the fleecing of one's persons, I quote, as prostitutes do when they fleece young men. That's part of the text. The social critique implies through these lineages, the Quevedo's Spain is no longer the type of Spain that engenders hirsute young men like the epic heroes of yore. So men like Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, who's mentioned in the poem, right? The Cid. These were hombres lanudos. These were woolly-haired men who were ideal in their lack of sweet refinement. And I think it's really important here to underscore that this comparison sets the original impression that we have of Cid, this beautified man with big beard, right, but still well-groomed. It sets this impression on his head. The Cid's unrefined qualities are elided, right? We don't talk about the adornment of his hair, only his masculinity, right? Ironically, however, it's the bald man, the man without the hair, that here in Quevedo appears to be the refined, courtly gentleman. So Quevedo's impudent critique of 17th century Spain and European decadence is again brought about in another letrilla, which I have here, with the opening line, que el viejo con destreza, the old man who adroitly, and I'll go to it in a second, right? It was a letrilla, which was published in 1605, but was written several years before, now takes the old man type and focuses on the dishonesty of falsehoods. So now we have another representation of not the positive, but the negative one. And cosmetics appears here as a negative marker of vice. The first stanza is the following, and I will quote the Spanish one just to the English. If the old man who adroitly dyes, paints, and makes himself shine, if he drops inky smudges on his papery head, may he, that perverse old man, correct nature with his madness. May he wake up a black crow, having fallen asleep a white dove. It's no matter to me. This black crow is kind of in Aesop's tale, the crow with borrowed feathers, borrowing. And most studies that analyze this poem focus on the debt that Quevedo has to classical authors like Aesop or Martial. But these studies generally elide the gender differences, the gender references in both literary works. Lisa Schwartz-Lerner, in an admirable work that's dedicated to metaphor and satire in Quevedo, contextualizes the antithesis that's formed by the black crow and the white dove, associating each with women and cosmetic use negatively, right? Because moralists at the time condemn cosmetic use and claim that it is a female practice, which is not the case. But anyway, so even though she associates this with women and cosmetic use, she recognizes that the animals that are being used in this text, right, are masculine, and that Multiple variations on these animals used similarly are used to poke fun at the vanity of an aging man who wishes to appear younger. The critique of men who use dyes to color their hair or their beard appears at least 8 times, probably more, within Quevedo's satirical poetry. In a poem that's called Desmiente a un viejo por la barba, Quevedo makes several references to the dyeing of facial hair. So here's the beard that is lying, right, to the old man. It was, by the way, it was fairly easy to find pictures of old men with dyed hair on the internet. Don't know why. Okay, here. I'll do this one in Spanish because it's relatively short. Cabello que dice en canario, muy mal a cuervo se aplica, ni es buen Jordán el tintero al que envejece la pila. So that hair that hit upon the canario cannot be ascribed or cannot be applied to the blackbird, nor is the inkwell the good river Jordan, who ages the baptismal font. The play on words here between canario, a man from the Canary Islands, and cana, gray or white hair, makes this translation really difficult. Okay? As does the relationship between the tintero, the inkwell, the Jordan River, and the baptismal font. So, one might associate the Jordan River with a reddish or brown color due to the riverbank, the earth that's on its riverbanks. It could also associate through metonymy a personified baptismal font which represents youth. The river identified with John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus Christ marks the beginning of one's spiritual life. In this way, it can be seen as a starting point of one's spiritual life, which cannot happen. So again, it's this criticism on a man who tries to appear younger than he is, exposing, again, the hypocrisy, the vice of trying to be what you are not. Okay, so often Quevedo attaches an underlying explanation to the old man's ridicule. The viejo, the old man, is derided, either because he is desirous of presenting himself to advantage, romantically, but also politically. Such is the case of several poems, which I'm not going to describe all of them, relating to the old man, the older gentleman who uses dyes, including a sonnet called A un viejo teñido, in which the hair dyes are conveyed by the different colors seen in the old man's hair and by the repeated reference to an inkwell. Inkwells, this Jordan River appears nonstop in these examples. The old man is exposed to greater mockery because he avoids being being viewed as a viejo escudero. He does not want to be considered an old squire. So why doesn't he want to be called an old squire? The term, the squire, in its most common if outdated usage, right, is associated primarily with youths that are seeking to rise in chivalric standing and become renowned knights. But contemporary usage of the word squire suggests that the meaning is somewhat altered. It could also mean somebody who waits upon a lady or gentleman. In 1620, there's an Italian dictionary that admits a sordid explanation, which is that he might be an intermediary or maybe a pimp, right? Or he might be, or it might reinforce his diminished economic stature, that he needs to work in order to be able to survive. In any of these cases, the use of the word escudero, which he does not want to be associated with, soldier, right, is used as a shield to protect him from a more demeaning occupation. Now, not all men who dyed their hair are criticized for their upward aspirations of love or politics. In the satirical letrilla called La pobreza el dinero, poverty, money, Quevedo scathingly derides that money has allowed vanity to skew society's understanding of reality. In the previous poem, the old man dyes his hair to give the appearance of what he is not. Here, the old man dyes his hair, but because of his wealth, the world accepts what he is not. Here, the old man dyes his hair, and money is the reason why the one-eyed man is called a gallant, a beautiful man, and the foolish man is seen to be prudent. Money is also the reason why. Money is also the reason behind our ignoring the avaricious man's gray hair. He appears attractive to everybody thanks to his wealth. The social status of the caballero in another letrilla called Más no ha mas no ha de salir de aquí, grants him a certain social standing. Although the proximity of caballero, gentleman, to cabello, hair, and even cabellera, wig, recalls the reader to the polysemous nature of Quevedo's poetry. Oh, sorry, this is the one. Nevertheless, the open secret of this worthy gentleman is that he dyes his hair. And here he says, right, I know a gentleman who dyes his hair in vain. To not appear gray, he wants to look like an inkwell. Being the snow of January, he fashions himself as the flower of May. But this shouldn't go any further. Shh. This not-so-secret ridicule of the old gentleman who wishes to look younger does so, seemingly for amorous reasons. The old man is, after all, in the final season of life, but he wishes to return to the springtime of youth. The metonymic overlap that's correlating the seasons of the ages to the stereotyped activities of each, springtime being a time of love and the winter being a time of death, it suggests the desire in the old man to return to a more youthful and amorous time. The same sentiment may be indicated by the viejete palabrero, the old windbag, and the letrilla, y no lo digo por mal. I don't mean this in a bad way. This old man goes to bed a canario, canary, but also a man who's full of gray hair. But he wakes up a jilguero, a goldfish, which is blonde, yellow hair. Right? The letrilla again returns to the Jordan River as inkwell, describing it as the means to dye the beard and mustache hair in a multitude of colors. In all of these poems, old men appear what they are not. But because, in this instant, is money, the world seemingly agrees. I'm getting to the end. So, I think 2 more examples. The romance titled Los Borrachos, the Drunkards, is both a burlesque poem and a social satire. It has alternately been described as 4 drunk men who were governing the world from a tavern. It might be understood as an erotic representation of bucolic poetry, in which the sordid details of tavern life replace bucolic landscapes and idealized shepherds. The thematics of the poem's alternate title, however, superimposes the court life with the bar, the underbelly of society, right? And connects the drunkard with the noble courtier, whose purpose is to aid in the governance of the kingdom. Now, Ignacio Arellano has noted that Quevedo's satirical poetry largely ignores these institutions of power, the monarchy, the military, the church. But Quevedo does not turn his invective upon, but Quevedo does turn his invective upon others, and even those who have political power. Now, it's not the point of this talk right now to expose all of Quevedo's spleen, just the ones that are cosmetically enhanced. Enrique Fernandez writes the following, and I quote, "In spite of, or perhaps because of, Quevedo's proximity to the court, he was painfully aware of the political reality of the contemporary court. And it was far from the heavenly order that a divinely inspired monarchy was supposed to incarnate. So he witnessed firsthand the corrupt trading of power among courtiers, the insolvency of a profligate crown, and the disastrous military campaigns that characterized the ineffectual rule of the later Spanish Habsburgs. So we see in the poetry, if I might emphasize again, this idea that through the cosmetic machinations of older men, right, this desire to participate in governance, even while they are incapable of participating in governance. And to root all of that, everything that is happening in Spain seems to be degraded. The awareness of Quevedo's proximity to the court makes probable his disdain and envy for those whose influence has outstripped his own. In what Enrique notes is Quevedo's critique of those who would put their own interests before all else, one sees the drunken characters of the Romance ballad as pícaros, these lowlives, who would rather be privados, who want to be the privates who have access to the king. These characters are 2 opposing types of the social order that are used to lampoon the ambitions and hubris of characters that make up part of the Spanish society. And the arrogance and ambition of the ballad's drunken officials, the lamentable topsy-turvy Spanish world is lamented. Through them, Quevedo shows the disillusionment with a world in which inflation has overtaken wages, the cost of clothes and other necessary items have become excessive, the frivolity of dress and fashion has overtaken their function, society has become immoral through the inversion of traditional gender norms, and presumably the laxity of military defenses. This last disillusion is manifested cosmetically. No hay barba cana ninguna, porque aún los castillos pienso que han tenido las suyas a persuasión de los viejos. So there's a play on words here between barba cana, what's separated means the white beard, and barbacana all put together, or barbican, which is an outer wall defensive structure in a castle or city. The play on words makes possible a series of ideas that lessens the symbolic import of the military defenses and the Spanish nobility. In the joke, old men have persuaded castles, soldiers, to alter the defensive structure of the castle, traditionally understood as a military fortification. The implication is that all that represents military might is now under the aegis of an old man or old men. They have made a lie out of those whose job is to defend. So, I'm getting to the end. These not few references to masculine hair dye must be considered as part of a critique on men, or at least the practices of men living in the court and within Castilian society. Quevedo offers what is now my final sonnet, Justifica su tintura un tiñoso. A dyed man justifies his dyed hair, in what appears to be an apologetic defense of the age, but really is not. And I will quote this in English. So, the old age, who is the washerwoman of mustaches, using the soap of years past, puts her wash to soak in my beard, and leaves my mustache hairs reddish yellow. I cook my youth with almadroc, and mix red and brown hair, since the snow that these past years have thrown at me still doesn't look good against the nape of my neck. It's better to be a false, enchanted, medically created crow than a white-haired canary. My beard is entirely ciembinos, 100 wines, red and white and light green, and a pharmaceutical. The vicissitudes of time have excessively adorned it, and so its restoration has come completely well. Here, the word teñir, which appears here, to dye, competes with less favorable meanings of the word tiñoso, actually on top, right? Which either means one has ringworm, or one perhaps by association is mangy and miserable. The negative aspects of the poem lessen after the quartets, although the associations near their end cannot be ignored. Quevedo personifies old age in the guise of a washerwoman, calls maybe the literary Celestina to mind. This washerwoman dyes the old man's facial hair with the soap of years past, covering his mustache with iscariotes, right? Now, the obvious link between the mustache and Judas Iscariot lies in the reddish or reddish gold color which the unfortunate disciple was usually painted. These colors are further denoted through the recipe for almadroc, a cheesy casserole that is usually cooked with squash or eggplant, again resulting in a reddish yellow color. I have to admit here that the first two quartets offer oblique religious references that offer damning praise to the cosmetic washerwoman and the older man. Excuse me. Offering Iscariotes would seemingly represent an act of public betrayal, since the washerwoman is aiding in the older man's deception over society. That this betrayal may have anti-Semitic overtones cannot be conclusively decided, but given that the casserole is something that has been associated with Sephardic cooking, anti-Semitic messaging here cannot be summarily ignored. Quevedo continues, symbolically using foodstuffs within his first tercet, suggesting that the older man's beard is composed of colors from different varietals of wine. The beard is reddish, tinto, white, blanque, a straw yellow with a greenish hue, verdea, and produced pharmacologically, letuadio. It is the final tercet that Quevedo offers faint justification for the old man's actions. With reasoning not dissimilar to those found in medical manuals, the man proclaims that his beard was black at the start, so it should be black always. Because time has adorned it to excess, the old man reasons that it should be restored now to its youthful color by artificial means. So, to synthesize this message laid out by the negative examples, showcasing the effects of time, I conclude. The bald man, shows the inexorable nature of time, which arrives to reinforce the anxious eventuality of death for everybody. The comic wit with which Quevedo describes time, we like. This is another poem that I cut. Jumping from hair to hair, from beard to beard, turning what was brown to white, and shaving the head of a man to leave bald so that flies can stand, so that his claws can be exposed, reduces man to a mask. The wit that Quevedo uses to expose, distort, willfully paint the bodies of those who adorn themselves through superficial, cosmetic hair dye, reinforces a moral message that time cannot be stopped, that what is being faked, the falsity that is being provided against to society, the false appearance that is being shown to society, everybody can see it. Nobody's being fooled. So hair dye reinforces a moralized message that time cannot be stopped. The dyed old man reinforces his white-haired counterpart, even while it parodies the desire to present oneself again as a powerful and potent youth. Cosmetic adornment, highlighted in a society obsessed with appearances over reality, which for Quevedo exposes the man and the society and presents them as frauds, is the key point in this talk. These descriptions might be seen as mirrored negative examples, bald men, cosmetic men, to exemplify the decay of Spanish society and the falsehood that it reveals, this illusion, this engaño, that informs, for many people, the ethos of 17th century Spanish Revolution. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions?
First of all,
Cristina, por favor.
yeah, Veronica. So Cristina, this is an uneducated question by a non-literature scholar, but in looking at the poem of the Cid, I've seen notes that talked about his beard as, notes are saying, we don't know what to do with his beard, which is why, thank goodness you're doing something with his beard, right? That's wonderful talk, and so glad that you're working with this really interesting evidence. But they've also said, could it be a sign of mourning? Have you found anything on that?
I have seen that as one of the explanations. It's not a convincing argument to me. But yeah, and one of the ones that particularly seems more convincing to me and does not include a cosmetic explanation is the idea of aborto, right? These chivalric oaths that people took that might not necessarily be, that he's doing it to provide this physical manifestation of his power, which is that I'm not going to do this until I've been born.
Right.
But the text never says that.
Right.
So I don't think it's a very convincing argument. I think we have to see cosmetics, or at least the physical representation of men adorning themselves as part of the culture of the time, which is not in keeping with, let's say, the way people have interpreted the certain past centuries or so.
Thank you.
I have a question to pick up on one of the a little bit of introduction. What market does cosmetic become a medicine?
So I think originally it's seen as a medicine. So you've got there's a 10th century treatise on cosmetics, again from an Arabic source, that is introduced into the European West, and then is translated and used by people like Gerardo Cremona and Henri de Monville in their surgeries and their books, and that talk about how this has practical applications. And there's one phrase, I think it's in Mondeville's surgery, where he specifically associates cosmetic practices with women and with urban towns. And he says, this people who study this aspect or who deal with this kind of practice will make a lot of money. He doesn't say it in exactly those words, but he does say something like that, which shows that doctors were using these practices, but they were also kind of lining their pockets. And we get really rich. I know that it kind of went off topic of your question. But, yes. Yes.
First of all, thank you for the fascinating talk. As a follow-up on what you just said, actually, how does this discourse compare to the discourse on women in the cosmetics in the same era?
Wait a year on my book will be out about that.
I was just wondering if they're the same tropes, sort of the vanitas theme applied to everybody, or if there's a difference between how men are treated and how women are treated.
So generally speaking, the attitudes are the same. There's a negative, in the Middle Ages, there's definitely a negative attitude towards cosmetic use, but it is very much conditioned to be an expressively female activity. So you can see from earliest days, you can see in Tertullian. I use these terms. I reference these people in Spanish, so I never know how to pronounce them in English. Tertullian, is that Tertulliano? No, sorry. But he's one of the earliest church fathers, and he's one of the first people that take this cosmetic message based on, I think, a Stoic philosophy, which is not gendered, and he takes this image and sees women as being kind of represented as ornament. And then that kind of an idea is picked up by other church fathers, which then is this, kind of gives the moralistic overlook that cosmetic use, in particular, what it does is it usurps the power of God, because God gave you this beautiful face, and you are trying to be more than God by changing it, by altering it. So there's an implied moralistic message from early Christian days that then comes into conflict once you start seeing medical treatises come in, and the idea of money to come in, and the professionalization of medicine to come in, and all of these many multiple factors I could speak hours on. But if I can summarize it in a couple of sentences, as you see the medical profession begin to be developed with the rise of universities, with the licensing of doctors, and apothecaries, and these other paratextual men, right? As soon as you see this licensing come in, women are marginalized from the medical world, of which cosmetics formed a part. And by their marginalization, they become not subjects of studying cosmetics, but objects to be studied by men. And then also in a parallel time, you see the idea of ornamentation being taken up, especially with the adaptation of gynecological textbooks, books that are talking about women and reproduction, the Trotula texts, and the development of books of secrets. That then, once you get to the Golden Age, then kind of explode into this in a non-professional way. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So up through the Middle Ages, you kind of see women marginalized from cosmetic use, their access to products and their being able to do this licitly becomes seen as more and more this dangerous, bad, evil, sinful thing. I hope that kind of helps. Happy to talk about this more and later if you want.
I have a comment, a question.
Sure.
I don't know, some of you, I don't know if you know, in Seville, of course everybody knows about Seville, but there was just a big controversy because they restored an image of the Virgin, and they took some of the shine away that was put in the 19th century, and it became a real big deal because the guy who did the restoration has been ostracized, he's been accused of lies or threats and all that. And when you're showing the images of the Virgin, I was wondering if they work the same way. They work as a reference as to how to colorize yourself.
That is something I don't know anything about. But women, especially women who are cosmeticians, are often referred to as painters. And I think there's a quote from Boccaccio de Cassibus, I think, where it's almost an apology, actually, considering how misogynistic that book can get, where it talks about women as kind of a canvas, and that through time, right, gets smoked, it gets damaged through time, and he talks about this idea of the paint on a wall being kind of made dull by the passage of time, and then compares it to women and why they use cosmetics. So I would think that the painterly metaphor and maybe using the virgin as an ideal is an interesting thing. But I don't know the answer to that. Yes.
So you brought this wonderful recipe to us, right,
Yes.
for wrinkles. I think about family recipe books and women sharing their medicinal recipes. Have you encountered any, could you tell us more about hair dye? And if you've encountered family recipe books thinking about men's hair or only women's, or if it's gendered at all?
Boy, could I ever. Honestly, not in the Middle Ages. So we were just speaking before the talk about Estefanía de Requesens. She's this noble woman from Catalonia, was born right outside of Barcelona, and lived with her mother until she got married to this Castilian who went to court. And she's got a whole bunch of letters that she writes to her mother. Her mother's back in Barcelona and Valencia, and she's at the court in wherever the empress is, because the husband is the future tutor to, the tutor to the future king, Philip II. And in these letters, she makes a lot of references to the recipes that she's gotten from her mother. And she writes that she has all of her mother's recipes. But in addition to that, there are other references to the empress, who wants to dye her gloves a golden color. And so the empress gives Estefania, this recipe that Estefania then sends to her mother to have made. And we've been able to trace who the people are that were involved in this process of beautifying gloves. It's not face necessarily, but it is something. So there are different references to gloves that are being dyed, to the making of jasmine waters, scented waters of all sorts, and the reference to this non-poisonous cosmetic face cream that will turn one's face white. It's based out of the citron, and it's kind of an astringent that will clear up pimples. And she says exactly, like, I have need of this because I've got some pimples on my face. Okay, but that's not all. In the 15th century, so now we are talking Middle Ages, there's a book written by Manuel Diaz de Calatayud, who talks about beauty products. There's about maybe, I'm going to get it wrong, but there's over 40, I think, cosmetics about anything from how to cure a bruise, how to cure a facial bruise, which to me is really interesting because it's like, why did this woman get a facial bruise? Right? Are we thinking maybe some sort of like domestic violence here? But how to cure a bruise, how to make one's skin clean, how to brush how to like a toothpaste powder. There's tons of recipes for hands to make one's hands soft. There's some recipes as to how to make one's private areas tighter. There's recipes for dyes as well, I think. In addition to that, I think you probably know about the book of, oh my God, what is it called? There's a Jewish medical handbook that's written by that's been translated by Carmen Caballero Navas, the Book of Love, which includes a lot of medicinal recipes. And there's the Manual de Mujeres, which I think comes later, that includes also a lot of hair dyes and recipes for that. And lastly, my last thing, two things. In the 15th century, there are two works that discuss female cosmetics. One is the Corbacho by Alfonso Martinez, who gives you, as a cautionary tale, it gives you tons of recipes, not how to do them exactly, but he doesn't list ingredients about these different types of recipes that women do in order to beautify themselves. And lastly, La Celestina talks about specifically two references to a breath mint and a hair dye to turn one's hair gold. So there are tons of references to cosmetics. You just have to look for it. Yes?
This is kind of a follow-up on a previous question, but you talked a lot about how wrinkles are like signs of like a sinful life, and I was curious if things like other skin imperfections that maybe are more specific to women, like stretch marks, were considered somewhat similarly?
So most manuals, when they talk about beauty, they talk about things that can be visually seen in public, which of course you have to take that with a grain of salt. Not women had access to all public spaces, but the loci, the places of female beauty, were basically more of things that could be seen. So one's hands, one's face were there. Again, in La Celestina, if you haven't read it, you really should. It's awesome. But there's this reference. I think it's in Act 9. It's a book it's a novel in dialogue, so it reads like it's a play, but it's got 21 acts in it. But in Act 9, there's a scene, a dinner scene, where there are two prostitutes talking to their lovers and the Celestina herself. And she starts, one of the prostitutes is talking about ideas of female beauty. And so the love interest in this book is this young woman called Meridea, who's all of 21 years old. But this prostitute, Areusa, talks about things that are aging in this 21-year-old body. And so she claims that this woman who is 21 years old has, and I apologize, I'm gonna say some really disturbing things right now. But she's got breasts the size of cantaloupes that fall down below her belly, and she's got a belly that looks like she's given birth 3 times. So these are not necessarily related to only obliquely related to sinfulness, because these are all characteristics of a woman who is a virgin still, and these references to having had children is obviously indirectly a sign of sinfulness. What you'll see, though, in a lot of medical texts from the late 15th century onward is this idea that women have been ravaged by time, and that God gave them this beautiful body, and it is therefore incumbent upon women to care for the body, to restore it back to this divine original state. And that you see in the Flower of Beauty, which is the book by Manuel Diaz de Calatayud, and you'll see it also in certain other treatises that come afterwards. I love this stuff, so I can go on forever.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.